Hello. This channel is an audiobook channel where we read and reflect together on little books created by hand. Disasters always arrive without warning, but in the very middle of them, they reveal most clearly what human beings truly are. When everything is swept away, when familiar roads, homes, and everyday life collapse in a single moment, people instinctively want to hold on to their own lives. And yet, even in moments like that, some choose to think of others first. The story we will read together today is about such a person. In the massive flood that struck the outskirts of Manila, the Philippines, in 2009, Muelmar Magallanes chose the lives before his eyes over his own safety. He did not step into the water for applause. He hurled himself again and again into the raging current because he could not turn away from those disappearing before him. This is a record of one person's sacrifice, but at the same time, it is a testimony to how deeply and fiercely human beings can save one another. Today's book, The Miracle of 18-year-old Muelmar in the Flood. I will begin now. It was a place where the peaceful, drowsy sound of cicadas lingered in the air, where at the entrance to narrow alleyways, one could hear children kicking up dust as they ran, mingled with the clattering turn of an old bicycle chain. In the evening, the acrid smoke of dinner fires rose from every house and settled low over the neighborhood. No one imagined that such a modest daily life would become the prelude to the end of their world. No one could foresee the hell that was about to come. In late September 2009, there was a low-lying village on the outskirts of Manila in the Philippines called Bagong Silangan, beside the winding Marikina River. Far removed from the dazzling neon lights of downtown Manila, it was a slum like a shadow of the city itself. People lived under roofs pieced together from discarded plywood and rusted tin sheets, and when it rained, it was normal for water to drip through the ceiling. Yet the narrow, twisting alleys were always filled with the sound of neighbors laughing, and the bond among them was so close that they knew even how many spoons each family owned. The children grew up jumping bare-bodied into the cloudy, lukewarm river water. However crushing the poverty, it was still their own peaceful and complete universe. And in one corner of that universe lived an 18-year-old young man named Muelmar Magallanes. His family and neighbors called him by the nickname Toto. Because his family was poor, Muelmar had been forced to leave school early. While friends his age put on clean white uniforms and walked to class, he went silently each day to a noisy construction site where dust flew through the air. Beneath the punishing heat of the midday sun, he carried heavy cement sacks weighing dozens of kilograms on his shoulders and hauled rough bricks day after day. The small amount of money he earned from exhausting labor went not into his own pocket, but straight to the dinner table of his aging parents and younger siblings. The palms of Muelmar's hands were marked with thick, coarse calluses that seemed impossible for an 18-year-old, like metals pressed into his skin, and his bent shoulders always smelled faintly of cheap pain relief patches. But not once did he resent his hard life or direct anger at the world. On the contrary, his strong body, hardened by labor, and the swift, effortless swimming ability he had naturally learned while growing up near the Marikina River were quiet sources of pride for him. Even when he himself was hungry, he was the kind of boy who would gladly tear off a piece of bread to feed a starving stray wandering the alley. His heart was steady and kind. Though he knew he would have to put on his worn safety helmet again tomorrow and the day after and return to carrying bricks, the fact that his beloved family was beside him was enough to keep a crease-free smile on his face. But nature sometimes destroys the humble universe of human beings with a merciless ease, as if crushing an anthill underfoot. At dawn on September 26th, the sky darkened into a strange, bruised black, and with low, growling thunder that seemed to shake the earth, the tropical storm Ondoy, internationally known as Quetzana, made landfall over Manila. The early forecast had described it only as heavy tropical rainfall. In a region where typhoons pass through several times each year, people were accustomed to frequent rains during the wet season. At first, no one was greatly alarmed. They thought that if the roof leaked, they would simply place more buckets under it, and if water seeped into the room, they would move their belongings a little higher and wait for the night to pass. But Katsana was not ordinary rain. It was closer to the collapse of a massive dam in the sky. In just 12 hours, the storm dumped an astonishing 455 millimeters of rain over Metro Manila. It was as if the amount of rain that would normally fall over a month, or even two, had been poured down in half a day. It was the worst deluge in 40 years of Philippine weather records, and an apocalyptic downpour said to be twice the rainfall brought by Hurricane Katrina, which had devastated New Orleans and shocked the world. Soon, the ground gave up trying to swallow the rain. The city's old drainage systems, unable to withstand the pressure, overflowed and spewed foul-smelling muddy water like fountains. And the place that was struck first by irreversible tragedy was Bagong Silangan, the riverside village that lay below the level of the embankment. The Marikina River, which usually flowed gently around the village, suddenly began to roar like a starving beast as tens of thousands of tons of rainwater rushed into it. Then, around 9 in the morning, the embankment gave way with a deafening crash. A massive torrent tore through the concrete wall like a tsunami and swallowed the village whole. In just 10 minutes, the village was submerged beneath an enormous sea of mud. The boundaries of the alleys vanished. Cement walls collapsed one after another as though blasted apart. Refrigerators as large as small houses, overturned cars, and jagged fragments of torn-off roofs spun wildly in the flood as if trapped inside a giant mixer, transformed into deadly weapons floating across the surface. People who had awakened too late, with no chance to escape, were sucked helplessly into the black water. Those who somehow survived scrambled onto flimsy tin roofs or the tops of bare trees, crying out desperately to the sky for rescue. Animal-like screams and the shattering sounds of breaking objects shook the air in every direction. It was a primordial hell where reason, civilization, and mercy no longer existed. Yet, in the heart of that endless darkness and despair, there was one person who proved that human beings do not always surrender helplessly before the overwhelming violence of nature. The water that burst into Muelmar's living room was nothing like the calm river he had known. The ochre-colored torrent smashed through the cracks of the door and surged upward like blood, covering his knees, then his waist, then his chest in an instant. His parents lost their balance in the muddy current and stumbled, while his 3 younger siblings screamed in terror as the water rose to their necks. Household belongings bobbed and slammed against the walls. If they delayed even 1 minute, the entire family would be drowned forever inside that small room. In that split second, something beyond ordinary human fear moved Muelmar's body. He plunged deep into the filthy water, unable even to open his eyes. Feeling blindly around the room while holding his breath, his hand found a thick, rough nylon rope he had once brought back from a construction site and left in a corner. Bursting back to the surface, he wasted not a second. He wound one end of the rope several times tightly around his own waist, then fastened the rest around the waists and arms of his 3 younger siblings, linking them together like train cars. "Don't cry. No matter what happens, hold on to my waist as hard as you can. Don't let go." Bearing the full weight of the children hanging from the rope, Muelmar threw himself into the violent current. Outside the house, the flood had already become a mad torrent. Swimming against it was something even an Olympic swimmer could hardly do unassisted. Worse still, the water was a minefield. Shards of ripped tin roofing, rusted nails from broken furniture, and fragments of shattered glass came hurtling through the current, slashing mercilessly at his arms and legs. His flesh was cut open, and blood spread into the muddy water, but Muelmar had no time even to feel the pain. Biting his lip, feeling the weight of the young lives tied behind him, he drove himself forward with desperate strokes toward the roof visible across the flood. After barely pushing his siblings up to safety, Muelmar turned back toward the violent water before he had even caught his breath. His elderly parents, trapped in the house and losing strength, were still there. Once again, he swam through that minefield of death, returned home, and supported the arms of his waterlogged, collapsing parents until he finally brought them to the roof of a safe shelter. At last, the family of 6 huddled together, soaked through and trembling, feeling one another's warmth in disbelief. His parents broke down crying from the miraculous relief of being alive, and Muelmar too bent over with his hands on his knees, breathing in ragged gasps streaked with blood, trying to steady his chest. As the eldest son, and as a human being, it seemed as though the responsibility he had to bear for his own family had finally been fulfilled. In the face of disaster, when even his own survival had been uncertain, saving every member of his household was already a dazzling act. But when Muelmar slowly raised his head from where he had been catching his breath, his eyes were not fixed on the safe refuge where his family stood. They were fixed on the Black Sea below, where cries for help still echoed. The rain showed no sign of stopping. In the middle of that waterlogged world, on isolated rooftops, broken electric poles, and building terraces, dozens, hundreds of neighbors were still trapped. They were not faceless strangers. They were the woman next door who offered warm bread with a smile in the morning. They were the neighborhood children who had played marbles with his siblings only yesterday. They were the old man next door who, unable to walk well, sat on his worn chair and watched over the alley. They were another kind of family, people who had shared a lifetime of joy and sorrow together in those cramped streets, and now they were being swept away in the flood, crying out in agony. "Help us! Please, somebody help!" Standing on safe ground, Muelmar could not turn his back on those tearing cries. Slowly, but with certainty, he turned once more toward the torrent. Behind him, his mother Maria let out a horrified scream and grabbed his wet arm with desperate force. "Please don't go. If you go in there, you'll die for sure. You've done enough." Even through his mother's desperate pleas and tears, Muelmar looked at her once with deep, unwavering eyes, gently removed her hand from his arm, tightened the rope around his bleeding waist once more, and stepped without hesitation back into the gaping mouth of hell. What began then was Muelmar's final struggle, an act of transcendence and sacred courage beyond what the fragile human body should ever have been able to endure. He first climbed onto a roof that shook as if it might collapse at any moment. There, he hoisted an elderly neighbor, trembling like a leaf in terror, onto his broad back and jumped again into the muddy flood. The pressure of the current, combined with the old man's weight, tried to swallow him whole, but he kicked against the water like a roaring beast and burst back to the surface. The moment he set the old man down on safe ground, he vanished back into the water again. This time, it was a 7-year-old boy, clinging to a floating wooden board and crying as he drifted away. Muelmar cut across the huge waves, caught the child by the back of the neck, and swam through the raging current with only one arm and both legs while holding the boy up above the water with his other hand. Once, twice, 10 times, 20 times. In a completely isolated zone where even helicopters could not fly and rescue teams had given up trying to enter, Muelmar's rescue efforts seemed never to end. Dragging the weight of a grown man against the flood meant agony that shredded muscle fiber like torn cloth. Because he remained so long in the freezing water, his legs were seized again and again by terrible cramps. His lungs screamed for oxygen as though they would burst. Every time he pushed another person above the surface, muddy water mixed with sewage forced itself into his body, and he vomited even stomach acid while coughing violently. Even when his shoulder slammed full force into a heavy wooden piece of furniture, sending pain like broken bones through him, the boy's unfocused eyes continued to search only for living people. All through that late afternoon, standing on the threshold of hell, Muelmar destroyed his own body to pull more and more lives from the flood. By the end of the day, he had saved more than 30 people, 30 lives, 30 complete universes, 30 futures that 30 families had nearly lost forever. And all of those worlds were preserved by one poor day laborer, paid for entirely with his blood, sweat, and torn flesh. But no matter how strong a young man he was, in a disaster so brutal that even steel machines might have been torn apart, the body of an 18-year-old boy was finally approaching absolute collapse. Utterly drained, Muelmar leaned his body against a shallow mound piled with debris, nearly collapsing there. His lips had turned the purplish color of someone on the edge of hypothermia, and his entire body shook violently beyond his control from the severe loss of heat. His sight was already growing dim and blurred, and the part of his brain governed by survival kept warning him with unbearable urgency. If you move one more time, your heart will burst. And then it happened. Through the roar of the flood came the most fragile and desperate sound in the world, the scream of a woman, sharp with a pain that seemed to tear the very bowels apart. "Help us! Please! Somebody save my baby!" Muelmar lifted his heavy head toward the sound. There, in a terrible blind corner where several branches of the flood converged through a narrow alley and churned into the most violent whirlpool of all, he saw a large white styrofoam box lid drifting through the center of the swirl. Clinging desperately to it were a young mother, Menchi Penalosa, and the 6-month-old infant she held tightly in her arms. The styrofoam floated like a spinning top in the furious current, twisting and being dragged downstream so quickly that no one could react. In just 10 seconds, the mother and baby would be pulled beneath the center of the whirlpool and vanish forever. The adults gathered along the embankment could only stare in horror, covering their mouths. No one dared jump in. Anyone with reason could see at once that to leap into that mad water in such an exhausted state would not be a rescue. It would be certain suicide. There was not a single rational reason for Muelmar to enter that water again. He had already saved 30 people unrelated to him by blood. He had already accomplished a miracle great enough to be honored proudly for a lifetime. Even if he had turned away at that moment, not even God could have condemned him. He had every right to survive and be praised. But Muelmar Magallanes did not calculate with selfish reason, and in the end, he refused to compromise with the vast fear of death. As if scraping together the last crumbs of life left in his body, he staggered to his feet. Steam-like breath escaped his lips. Around him, people screamed, "Toto! No, don't do it!" reaching out toward him, but as if called by something from another world, he cast aside every attempt to stop him and threw himself heavily into the water that would become the last of his life. Again and again, the current drove his head beneath the surface, trying to drag him under forever. But with an inhuman will, almost like that of the living dead, he forced his arms forward and at last managed to reach the white styrofoam box carrying the mother and child. But he had no strength left to pull it all the way back to shore. The terrifying downward force of the current had long exceeded what his torn muscles could bear. In that moment, Muelmar made the most beautiful and most heartbreaking final decision that only someone who has sensed death can make. He moved behind the floating styrofoam lid and pressed his broad shoulders and back tightly against it. Then, squeezing out even the last handful of air in his lungs, he turned his entire body into a shield against the torrent, a wall of resistance against the flood. At the same time, he kicked desperately with both legs, driving the box toward the embankment where people were stretching out their hands. It was like the first stage of a rocket igniting to break through the atmosphere, carrying the main body safely into orbit while the booster itself burned up and fell away. Muelmar was being dragged by the current into the endless downstream darkness, but he forced the box itself to ricochet towards safety on land. "Grab it!" That final animal-like cry tore across the muddy water as if spat out with blood. In answer to his desperate shout, the people on the bank lunged forward, screaming, and at last managed to seize the styrofoam box carrying Menchi and her 6-month-old baby. Their knees struck safe, solid earth. And at that very moment, the pale hand of Muelmar, who had spent the last of his life for someone else, slipped weakly from the edge of the white box. No! The people's desperate screams split the rain-filled air, but the 18-year-old hero had no strength left, not even a thread of it, to endure the many tons of current crushing him down. He threw back his head above the muddy water and gasped once, twice, fighting for breath, and then, leaving behind the voices calling his name, he was swept into the giant whirlpool and disappeared forever. It was the most radiant and most unbearably tragic of moments in history. He had pushed more than 30 vulnerable neighbors into the dazzling world of life, and then quietly sank himself into the dark abyss of death. The next day, as though the hell of the previous day had never happened, the sky cleared over the path Ketsana had taken, and the enormous floodwaters slowly began to recede. A full-scale search for survivors began in the devastated village. 2 days later, the cold body of Muelmar Magallanes was found buried quietly in a mass of mud far downstream from the whirlpool where he had jumped in. His entire body was covered in wounds, but his face looked strangely peaceful. When his body was washed by the hands of the villagers and laid in an old coffin prepared in one corner of the temporary shelter, the area around it became an ocean of grief. More than 30 neighbors whose lives he had saved knelt around the dirt-stained coffin, beat the ground, and wept uncontrollably. Menchi Penalosa, the mother whose baby had survived by Muelmar's final breath, held the child he had saved tightly in her arms and wept without end. Speaking with a trembling but certain voice to the microphones of reporters gathered around the boy's coffin, she said, "In that very last desperate moment, when the violent whirlpool was about to swallow the box carrying my baby and me whole, I felt an enormous force from beneath the water, something so powerful it did not seem human at all, pushing the box upward with everything it had. If he had not used that final strength to thrust us hard toward the shore, my baby and I would not be in this world today. To save my child, who had only just begun to see the light of this world, he gave up his entire youth and all of his bright future. As someone who survived, there are no words great enough to repay such a debt. When my baby grows old enough to understand, I will tell her every day whose breath and heartbeat allowed her to live and walk in this beautiful world. We will never forget him." His mother, Maria Luz, collapsed to the floor, holding her son's pale hand, scarred with calluses no one would believe belonged to an 18-year-old, and pressed it over and over against her cheek. Then, in a cracked voice, she whispered to her proud son, "My son Toto, even when he himself was hungry, would willingly break off bread for a starving puppy on the street. He always had such a warm heart, never able to ignore someone else in pain. I was a poor mother who could never even give him a proper pair of shoes, and all I did was make him suffer in the dust. But my son had a nobler and holier heart than any rich man or powerful man in the world. If I could bring you back to life by tearing out my own heart and giving it to you, I would." This heartbreaking and astonishing true story brought all of the Philippines to tears and soon spread around the world through international news reports. People everywhere, regardless of nationality, language, or wealth, were humbled before the superhuman sacrifice shown by a boy from one of Manila's poorest communities. That winter, the American news magazine Time looked back on the events and people that had moved the world in 2009 and named Muelmar Magallanes as one of the top 10 heroes of 2009. Not a billionaire in a cape from a movie screen, not a fictional superhuman with extraordinary powers, but a poor Filipino laborer from a slum, someone whose forehead was always wet with sweat, was recorded in history as a true hero humanity should remember. The following year, the Philippine government and international organizations continued to honor his sacrifice, posthumously awarding him the Earth Day Award. Human history is filled with tales of heroes, brave generals who crossed battlefields, scholars whose discoveries changed the world, politicians who reshaped entire systems. But why is it that the story of Muelmar Magallanes, soaked in mud and floodwater, still strikes our hearts so painfully and so deeply, even after all these years? Perhaps it is because what he saved was not merely the physical lives of 30 people. In a harsh modern world ruled by selfishness and cold indifference, where pushing others aside for one's own survival is often treated as natural, Muelmar fought against the torrent of nature with his entire body and asked humanity in its purest and most primal form a weighty question. How far can a human being throw himself away for another? Even in a crisis ruled by selfishness and beast-like brutality, what is the human dignity we must never surrender? A long time has passed since Muelmar left this world. The village of Bagong Silangan, which he loved, has risen again and reclaimed its life. What the boy pulled from the flood in his final moments was not merely a collection of bodies. It was tens of thousands of shining tomorrows in which people would once again embrace one another, love one another, grieve, and live on. Inside that white styrofoam box which the completely exhausted 18-year-old boy pushed upward with bloodshot eyes in the final instant, there was not only the warmth of the infant he saved, there was also the light of humanity itself, the brightest and greatest flame that must never be lost as long as humankind exists on this earth. A boy who burned himself up for others in the darkest heart of disaster and vanished as a star that would never go out. Muelmar Magallanes. The ordinary dull day we greet with casual complaints may, in truth, be part of a small and precious chain of miracles built upon the quiet sacrifices of countless people who loved others fiercely and willingly gave their own lives. As long as we do not let go of this warm hand of solidarity stretched toward one another, the white box that the boy raised up with his life will never sink into the swamp of despair. This channel is an audiobook channel where we share little books we have made ourselves with all of you. Next time, we will return with another meaningful story that leaves a lasting echo in our daily lives and in our hearts. Thank you sincerely for being with us. This was Sage, the cat author who delivers the world's knowledge through little books.